Part 1. Before that evening. Sometimes the most important stories don't begin with love. They begin with exhaustion. He lived in a constant state of pressure. His days looked the same: early mornings, coffee, phone calls, numbers, risks. He never allowed himself to slow down because he knew the moment he did, fear would catch up. Fear of not making it, fear of ending up with nothing, fear of living a life he didn't choose. He didn't have stability, but he had stubbornness. He was building something of his own, step by step, failing, losing, starting again. He rarely thought about relationships, not because he didn't want them, but because he didn't know how to live halfway. Love felt like something that required time he didn't have. She lived slower, not because life was easy, but because once it had been too painful. She learned how to protect the silence around her. Her days weren't filled with loud events, work, simple dinners, long walks, and the ocean. She went to the beach almost every evening, not for photos, not for people. It was a quiet Florida beach, no crowds, no music, no noise. That's where she allowed herself to think. Sometimes about nothing at all. She wasn't waiting for change. She was trying to put herself back together. They didn't know each other, and honestly, they weren't looking to meet. But that evening felt different. The sun slowly disappeared behind the horizon. The air was warm, not heavy. The waves rolled in quietly, almost carefully. He ended up on that beach by accident, and because he was tired, because he needed to escape his own thoughts, even if just for an hour. She was there out of habit. They hadn't spoken yet. They hadn't looked into each other's eyes, but in that moment, two lonely lives stood too close to each other. And this story began long before they said their first words. Part 2. The beach where no one was. In a hurry, he walked along the water slowly, almost without purpose. His shoes were in his hand, the sand still warm from the day. His phone stayed in the car, a rare luxury he allowed himself. The waves rolled in evenly, as if someone had designed the evening to be calm. She sat a little farther away, almost at the water's edge. Not on a towel, just on the sand. Knees pulled to her chest, eyes fixed where the sky met the ocean. She didn't notice him right away, and that mattered, because for the first time in a long while, she wasn't waiting for anyone. He noticed her by accident, not because of how she looked, but because of how she sat, as if she needed nothing around her. No music, no company, no explanations, just being there. He walked past her, then stopped. Not because he wanted to start a conversation, but because suddenly he didn't want to keep walking. For a few minutes, they existed random without intersecting. Two people. One silence, one horizon. Then the wind lifted the sand, and he instinctively stepped closer. She lifted her head. Their eyes met for just a second. No smiles, no curiosity. Just a quiet acknowledgement. You're here. Nice evening, he said finally. His voice was calm, a little tired. She nodded. Yeah, it's always quiet here. It wasn't a conversation. It was permission not to stay silent. He sat down nearby, leaving space between them. Just enough not to disturb her peace. They talked slowly. About the ocean, about how Florida sunsets always look like someone is trying to slow time down. He didn't ask too much. She didn't say more than she wanted to. And between the words, there was more than in the words themselves. At one point, she laughed softly, not loudly, almost to herself. And he realized that sound stayed with him. When the sun disappeared and the sky darkened, they sat a little longer. No one suggested leaving. No one checked the time. They didn't know each other's names. They didn't know what the other did for a living. They didn't know how much longer they would sit there, listening to the waves. They only knew one thing. There was something different about that evening. Not loud, not dramatic, but strong enough to stay with them. And when they finally stood up and walked in opposite directions, neither of them could explain why they felt the need to look back one more time. Part 3. The names that stayed. The next day, he came back to the same beach. Not because he was waiting for someone. He just wanted to know if the night before had been real. She appeared later, in the same light dress, holding a paper cup of coffee. When she saw him, she paused for a second. Not surprised. More like something quietly fell into place. "So you came back too," she said as she walked closer. "Looks like it," he replied. "It's easy to breathe here." They walked along the water, no longer keeping their distance. The conversation flowed slowly without tension, as if they'd known each other longer than they actually had. "By the way, I'm—" She hesitated slightly, then smiled. "Angela." "Michael," he said almost instantly, as if he'd been waiting for that moment. The name sounded simple, ordinary, but they stayed. He suggested walking into the city. No plan, no direction, just walking. They stopped at a small corner cafe. Big windows, the smell of fresh coffee, old wooden tables. She ordered a latte. He ordered black coffee, no sugar. They sat by the window, watching people pass by, talking about nothing important. About the city, the weather, about how strange it sometimes feels to be surrounded by people. He told her he worked too much and often forgot how to stop. She told him she'd learned not to rush. At some point, he laughed, for the first time in a long while, easily. And she noticed. When they left the cafe, the city was fully awake. Cars, lights, noise. But between them, there was still the same quiet where everything had started. And now that quiet had names. Haas Part 4. The happy years together and the tender wind. They spent more and more time together. At first, it was long evening walks through the city, cafes, laughter, and small details. Then, a small apartment by the ocean where even the silence felt alive because it belonged to them. He started his business. Small at first, barely surviving, but his own. Every day meant negotiations, calls, bills, planning, stress. Every victory came at the cost of nerves. She was always there, as encouraging, supporting, helping when he felt everything was falling apart. She made coffee at midnight so he wouldn't fall asleep over documents. She read his notes, gave advice, or simply placed a hand on his shoulder when he was tired. He dreamed of a big tender that could change everything. Stability, expansion, more time together. He was nervous and full of doubts, but she always said, "We can handle this together." Her faith was quiet but strong. The day the tender results were announced was full of tension. They decided to walk through the city, grabbed coffee at a small sunlit cafe, laughed at little things, but every step was filled with anticipation. He checked his phone more than he wanted. She felt his heart racing and simply held his hand. "No matter what happens, I am here," she said. He nodded, trying to stay calm, but inside he was wildly anxious. The phone rang as they walked back along the waterfront. He picked it up, and when he heard the result, a wide smile appeared instantly. They had won. The evening became a celebration. They walked through the city, holding hands, laughing, dreaming about the future. A small apartment by the ocean, trips, quiet evenings together, waking up without fear of tomorrow. Yet even in happiness there was a shadow. He knew this was only the beginning of the struggle. For the business, for stability, for the dream he had put on the line. She felt it too, but she simply held his hand and whispered, "Together is easier." Part 5. Crisis and Farewell. After several happy years, difficulties arrived. The business that once seemed stable began to fail. Clients delayed payments, partners backed out of contracts, expenses rose faster than income. He worked around the clock, trying to keep everything under control, but the numbers on the account felt cold and merciless. She saw his exhaustion, his sudden trembling from stress, sleepless nights, a gaze that no longer held its lightness. She tried to help, to support him, to encourage him with words and presence. But words could not change reality. "I need to find more clients," he said, sitting at the laptop at midnight. "You've already done everything you could," she whispered, holding his hand. He turned away, not out of anger, out of despair. Days grew longer, nights heavier. They no longer walked the city streets or laughed in cafes. Even the silence in the apartment became oppressive. Every glance carried tension. Every word could spark an argument. Then he lost a key tender, the one he had pinned so much hope on. It was a blow that you don't bounce back from easily. They sat in the kitchen side by side, yet not touching. She searched for his eyes. He stared into emptiness. "I don't know how we'll get through this," he said quietly. "Maybe we just need a break from each other," she replied. Her words tightened his chest. They both knew this was more than a pause. The following weeks passed in silence, trying to keep both the business and themselves afloat. They tried to be together, but both felt the growing distance. One evening, he stayed alone in the apartment for the first time in years, staring at the dark ocean outside the window. She stood across the city, also gazing into the night. They knew they loved each other, but love couldn't save everything. And then they quietly said goodbye. No shouting, no tears. Just acknowledgement that sometimes life separates even those who created happiness together. He stayed to fight the business. She stayed to fight for herself. They both knew that these 5 years would remain inside them forever, like quiet waves remembered only by the ocean. And though they walked different paths, the memory of their happiness remained, quietly reminding them. Once they were together and it was real.